The Lord has not given us a spirit of fear, but instead of love. That's why when we know exactly what tomorrow will hold, we must tell everyone to fear the future if they don't love God enough. All sinners should be anxious, and anyone who really loves God will never experience any anxiety at all. Amen? This is the Bible After Hours. Can you hear me? Is this thing on? Okay, good. I am the Foul-Mouthed Preacher, and this is the Underground Church. The word vulgar originally just meant to speak the language of the people. That's what Jesus did, that's what the apostles did, and that's what the prophets did, and that's what we're going to do here today. The church above often pushes messages about certain political ideas or political parties that are going to destroy our country or the world, or maybe they're the Antichrist, ? Family structures may cost your soul if you don't live with the correct people and the right person is in charge of the house and finances, whether he's bad at it or not. It's your soul on the line. Or even maybe your salvation may be lost if you fuck up. There's a lot of anxiety around things like politics, family, and all this that the church actually is propagating. It's bullshit, though. It's no reality in which our all-loving, all-powerful God looks down and goes, man, I want those fuckers to be filled with anxiety all the time, but only about the things that helps, this structure that I helped build known as the organization of the church. It's not true. It's not true that anxiety plays no role at all in our lives. It's not true that it's unhelpful. It's not true to ignore it, and it's not true that Christians don't have it. But it's also not true to act as though, anxiety should only exist for sinners. It's not true that we should feel anxious about whether or not God really loves us. It's not true that we should feel anxious about if the right person is in charge of our finances at our house. Chill the fuck out at the same time. Damn. I used to fear losing my salvation all the time. Any little fuck up I did, I was like, that's it. I lied. Do I need to pray for forgiveness? And then sometimes I'd stay up at night wondering, what if I sinned and didn't know about it? What if I accidentally lied? Because I was always taught, if you just were wrong about something, I said, hey, CVS is down the street, but it turned out it wasn't CVS, it was Walgreens. Well, then I lied, even if I really thought it was CVS. So I was constantly afraid that I could sin, have no fucking idea, and then just be damned for it. Go straight to hell. It came with a lot of anxiety. Once, I would even tell others that the Democrats in America are going to destroy our country. I said no Christian can be a Democrat, something I often told people. Whether it's by talking about hell, politics, or sin, a lot of how the church has thrived recently is by getting people anxious, where they're too anxious to leave the church, too anxious to question its teaching, too anxious not to be good little robot Christians. It's not all the church, but a lot of the church, that's what they're pushing. They're pushing anxiety because they know that's what'll keep people in line. Everyone experiences anxiety in their lives at some point, right? Even if it's just anxious about a newborn child, anxious about going to school. Not all anxiety comes with terrible shit happening in your life. Sometimes it's good shit happening in your life, but you're still anxious about. What if the next Avengers movie isn't as good as I want it to be? What if the next Star Wars movie fucks up the timeline or something? We have anxiety about all kinds of things, even some things that don't make any sense. Maybe it's over the future of your career. Maybe it's the future of your kids. Maybe you're anxious about finding your future spouse. Maybe you're anxious about losing your current partner. Could be finances that's causing your anxiety. Could be, again, even something small, like Star Wars, Marvel, Star Trek, all kinds of things, stupid shit can be the littlest things can cause us to be anxious. And sometimes we're tempted to just push it down and ignore that anxiety, especially when anxiety feels unreasonable. And often it is unreasonable. There's a lot of stuff we're anxious about we shouldn't be. Chances of lightning hitting you outside, not very high, but a lot of people are very anxious in storms. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But it's there. Anxiety is a real topic. It's a real concern, and it's something we have to address. You can't have conversations about someone's soul. You can't have conversations about the entirety of what it means to be human or how humans relate to God without talking about anxiety. But how should we handle it? If we're not going to just say, only sinners should feel anxiety, and we're not going to just say, well, God will make it better for Christians, and we're not going to say that we should be anxious to lose our salvation. What is it? If I shouldn't be anxious to lose my salvation, but also anxiety isn't just for sinners, then what do I do with that? If it's not just about whether you're right or wrong, how is anxiety useful? Is it useful? And how much anxiety is too much anxiety? Church used to have what they called hellfire sermons, where a preacher would go and kind of rampage on about what exactly hell would be like, the gnashing of teeth, the eternity of it all, who was going to be there. Even if you lived a perfect life and you didn't say the right prayer, you would burn forever with little bugs eating you, crawling out of your eye sockets. And they would get really into detail about how terrible hell was to try and scare people into praying what they considered the right prayer to help them receive salvation. They used fear and anxiety to try to push people into salvation. Some of these sermons still exist. For the most part, this has been kind of, we've moved past that as a church. But that was the thing. The church really thrived on doing that. Nowadays, usually, the stuff that concerns me is how a lot of churches push politics. You know, they make people anxious. If you're a Republican and you're supporting a man who slept with a porn star, then you're just as fucked up as he is. Damn everybody. Or the liberals want to take away church from America. Fuck them. They're going to kill you all. They're going to ban Christianity. They hate Jesus. Neither of these things are true, right? Like, you're not just as guilty as a man who sins because you voted for the man. You're also, the Democrats in America are not trying to take away the church. And there's nuance on both sides. There is. And there's no reason to be anxious if you're making the right choice. It's not going to cost your soul. I think the one side is clearly more evil right now. Donald Trump is an evil man. I will say that. But I don't think you should feel any kind of anxiety about, oh man, I voted for him last time. Am I an evil person? No. Maybe you voted wrong, but it's okay. But a lot of the church, they push people to feel anxious about politics now instead of hellfire. Historically, the church would persecute heretics because of a collective anxiety. The church as a whole was anxious that maybe this bad theology would start spreading and more people would follow that, and then the future of the church would be built on all these lies and bad beliefs instead of what we think of as the right beliefs. So what do? Instead of going to God about it, we're going to use that anxiety and we're just, you know what, fuck them all. We'll burn the heretics so that these bad theologies don't spread. They were anxious. They were afraid. And they killed people for having bad beliefs because they were afraid of it spreading. If they really had faith in what they believed, they should have known that it would be the belief that continued whether or not they murdered the people with different beliefs. They didn't really have faith in what they believed. They thought the only way to be sure that their beliefs went on and not the bad beliefs was to murder the other people. It was genocide a lot of the times, fueled by anxiety and a collective anxiety that the church has felt. So even organizations, even the church, is not immune to feeling anxious. And that brings us to Psalm 11. Last time we did Psalm 8, we're skipping Psalm 9 and 10. They kind of go together, so if you're doing the Psalms one at a time and you want to just kind of catch up on the off weeks, Psalm 9 and 10 really could just be one big psalm together. Which is part of why I didn't do it, because it's hard to separate the two for me, and I would rather read them together, and I didn't want to make an episode that long. So check it out on your own time, though. Psalm 9 and 10, they go together. Great psalms, but we are moving forward to Psalm 11. As always, I'm going to read it as a whole. We're going to talk about it as a whole. Then we're going to look at some of the specifics in the different verses of the chapter. Then we're going to go back and look at the psalm as a whole once more before moving on and wrapping up. So, Psalm 11. In the Lord I take refuge. How can you say to my soul, flee as a bird to your mountain? For behold, the wicked bend the bow. They have set their arrow on the string to shoot in darkness at the upright in heart. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The Lord in his holy temple, the Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see, his eyelids test the Son of Man. The Lord tests the righteous and the wicked, and his soul hates one who loves violence. He will rain coals of fire upon the wicked, and brimstone and burning wind will be the portion of their cup. For the Lord is righteous. He loves righteousness. The upright will see his face. So as a whole, this psalm is clearly about anxiety, the anxiety of David. It was likely written when he was still in the courts of Saul. You know, Saul is king. He's been prophesied to be king, but right now he's just kind of like a musician, sidekick kind of character. He's the second tier character, right? And people keep telling him to run away. You need to run away. Saul's going to kill you. Some bad shit's going to happen to you. And at this point in time, he wasn't ready to run. He believed God could protect him, whether he was in the courts of Saul or in the wilderness, wherever he was. He's like, really, God's going to be the one to protect me. It's fine. Eventually, we know in the full story of David's life, he does eventually run away from Saul's court, and he seeks shelter in in his caves and mountains, that kind of stuff. So he does eventually do this, but this time it's, again, Psalms are not prescriptive, they're descriptive. This is how David felt at that time when he was spending time with Saul, I believe. We're not sure when the Psalm was written, but I'm pretty sure this was when it was written. David knew at this point that he was called by God. He knew that he was in the right place where he was supposed to be, and he was still anxious. He was anxious about what Saul and the people of the courts might do to him. So let's break down a little bit what Saul and David's story is, because it's one of anxiety of both sides. So Saul was the first anointed king in Israel. So we did the judges previously on this show. After the judges, I mentioned the story of Samuel, how he was the last judge and he was one of the prophets. Samuel would eventually go on, since he's the last judge, he would have to anoint the first king of Israel because the people of Israel was like, we want a king to be like everybody else. So yeah, he went and anointed a king. The king was Saul. Saul was a godly and good man who eventually kind of got corrupted by the power of kingship, maybe other things. He kept wanting to do stuff for himself and not waiting on God or waiting on the prophets. And that kind of power lust kind of took over him, and he eventually goes mad. Because Saul kind of lost his way, God decides he's going to choose a new king. And Samuel, still Samuel, is actually the one who finds and anoints David as king. David was like the smallest brother out of a whole litter of people, and he was like a shepherd sting. And you probably heard the thing about Goliath and how David killed bears and lions protecting the sheep. There's two origin stories of David. One is that where Saul and them, they're facing Goliath, and David comes out and he's the only one who's brave enough with a swing shot. He's like, just like I killed lions and bears, I'm just going to throw a rock at this thing and it's going to fall down. He cuts the fucker's head off. That is one story, and that's, that story says this is when David first met Saul. A little bit later, same book, it says the first time that David met Saul. So this is, again, how we know the Bible probably isn't in narrative, probably isn't, one singular story. This is exactly how it happened. There's a bunch of stories kind of woven together and edited to piece together that sometimes conflict, but they have good meanings. So the other telling of, here's the first time David met Saul, had nothing to do with giants at all. There's another story that says the first time David met Saul, Saul's having these anxious dreams, anxious fits. He's scared to death of just random shit. And the only thing that seemed to be able to soothe him, to be able to sleep, is this perfect key, harmony, whatever. David's song. David was able to grab a harp. He found a key to play that would give rest and peace to Saul so he was able to sleep. If you've ever heard the song Hallelujah, there is a line in the song that says, there was a secret chord that David played that pleased the Lord. So this is that secret chord. David found a chord that somehow was able to bring peace, soothe the anxiety of Saul. So there's a little bit of anxiety in the story already. Then, as we go forward, what happens is Saul hears about the prophecy. He realizes David, the same one who's giving him peace, who maybe killed a giant, not sure how they first met, but we know one of these things. Either they met because David slayed a giant, saving Saul and his army's ass, or David played a secret chord to please the Lord that allowed him to have rest and ease his anxiety. Either way, Saul was either anxious about the giant that David came and fucking killed, or Saul was anxious about something else, couldn't sleep, and David played a chord that was able to give Saul peace. And now Saul knows that David's supposed to be the new king. And all of a sudden you start hearing in the streets people singing songs like, yeah, Saul killed thousands, but David killed tens of thousands. David's way cooler than Saul, right? And Saul's like feeling a little anxious. He's feeling a little, oh shit, this guy might take my spot. So he's thinking, and he is really turning against David. David's already married one of his daughters, so Saul's now his father-in-law. And all this shit's going up, and people are telling David, hey David, you need to watch your back. Saul's fucking crazy. David's like, nah, dude. And that's where the psalm is. It's like, nah, dude, it's fine. Eventually, Saul does try to kill David a few times, multiple times, before David actually ends up leaving. And part of it is because, David isn't just anxious of, oh, Saul wants to kill me. He's also anxious about, he married one of Saul's daughters. He's part of this family. His best friend is one of Saul's sons. He has family. He has relationships here that he doesn't want to leave. And he's anxious about that, reasonably so. So that's David's story at this point. Eventually, for those who want to know, David does become king. Saul dies in battle. That has nothing to do with David. David does not kill Saul. Saul does die, and David does become king. And, other stuff happens in that story, but this isn't the story of David. This is just some context for the psalm. So we looked at it as a whole. We see why David's anxious, and we see that he's saying, hey, I need to turn to God. I'm anxious. Things are fucked up right now. So let's look at some of the details, looking at some of the individual verses. We're actually going to look at all the individual verses, starting in verse 1 through 3. We're going to look at first. In the Lord I take refuge. How can you say to my soul, flee as a bird to your mountain? For behold, the wicked bend the bow. They have set their arrow on the string, to shoot in darkness at the upright in heart. And if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Can the Lord care for David in the courts and the wilderness equally? Here, where David is at this point, before he runs away, David claims refuge isn't a place. He says, I'm not taking refuge in the mountain. I'm not taking refuge in the courts. The first verse, in the Lord I take refuge. So he thinks refuge is found in God himself. The metaphor of a foundation crumbling, which is if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? That's the heart of David's feeling in this psalm. That is exactly where his heart's at. He's like, what? The very foundations, like the very things I think is like fundamental about my family, about my life as future king, about all this stuff, it's all being shaken to its core. I no longer know who I am, because who he is the son-in-law of the king. Who he is the one who plays harps to soothe the king, the leader of the armies of Israel, the best friend, the king's son. All of these wrapped up are part of David's identity, and now he's realizing things that he think of as like the core of who he is might not be there much longer. It's a good reason to be anxious. Sometimes it feels like the basics of what we know. Society, what we think of society. Maybe what we thought society was, who we thought we were as a people in our culture. Maybe that's being taken away from us. A lot of people are talking about being politically homeless in this time, where you thought you believed the same thing that all these Republicans did, and all of a sudden they start supporting a man who has no family values whatsoever. And you feel just completely politically homeless. It's a real reason to be anxious. Maybe the church. Maybe you no longer feel like you belong at the church you're at, but you still love God, you still want to be at church. Maybe that's causing you to be anxious. Maybe even your view of God could be challenged. That could shake your foundation, right? Like you thought God was all powerful, and now you're kind of seeing that maybe God's really powerful, but he's not able to do everything. He can't just force me not to sin and take my free will away. Maybe so there's some other aspect, like you thought that God was immanent in everything altogether, but you never thought of God, but you've never thought about God being transcendent. So even questions of like who God is that maybe has changed for you could cause some real anxiety. Sometimes we even learn that we're wrong about some things, about how things work. A lot of people gone through some form of deconstruction, whether it be about God, biblical inerrancy, other things that the church has taught them that they're like, maybe this stuff is just wrong. And when the stuff that you've taught, that you grew up with, you realize is wrong, that breaks your foundation. You don't know what's going to happen next. You don't even know who you are. David felt he had a foundation of family, of prophecy told of where he was going to be one day. He thought he understood. He thought he had a foundation with his friends who would last forever. And in this moment, he's realizing his family might cast him out. His father-in-law might try to murder him, and he would not become king in the way that he thought. Finally, the question of what the righteous can do. It's in perfect tense, which is weird Hebrew tense stuff. So the verse reads, what can the righteous do? If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Given the tense it is, it's more like, how could the righteous have even planned for what might happen? How could I even have came up with a plan for this? Sometimes there is no way to plan for what might happen. So this is rhetorical. He knows they can't. It's causing him real stress, real anxiety. We go to verses 4-6. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see. His eyelids test the sons of mankind. The Lord tests the righteous and the wicked, and his soul hates one who loves violence. He will rain with coals of fire upon the wicked, and brimstone and burning wind will be the portion of their cup. We see Yahweh, both in the temple and in heaven. This shows that God is both present among his people, the temple, which is in the middle of Israel, so think about who's singing David, among his people, but also in heaven, up above, overseeing. Here, David seems to show that he believes in a God that can tell the future, who's completely sovereign over exactly what will happen. I'm not so sure I believe that. Given other places in the Bible, it's not completely clear that God knows exactly what the future will be. Think about free will. What about free will, David? How could God possibly know what's going to happen if he's not controlling my choices? How does he know what I will choose? And some people say God's outside of time, all this kind of weird bullshit. But I don't think that's necessary for this. I don't think you have to agree with David that God's sovereign and knows the future. I think what you have to understand is that God is both immanent and transcendent, that God is powerful, that he is working with us, that he is in and among us and all around us. He is in our present, and he will be in our future, whether he is now or not. And the fact that God is present should still be a cause for comfort. The word for test, when God tests mankind, it's meant to denote all of the trials that we may face in this life. So all of life's trials. God oversees us with our marital issues, our financial struggles, our fear of the political state of our country, everything. God is overseeing. God is with us as we go through it. Finally, verse 7. For the Lord is righteous. He loves righteousness. The upright will see his face. So finally, David looks to God. Yeah, this is a psalm about anxiety, and it's making me feel anxious going through it. But at the end, he's like, but God. And sometimes that's annoying when pastors are like, oh, but God. But here it is. For the Lord is righteous, his righteousness. He loves righteousness. The upright will see his face. Finally, David looks to God. The same God that oversees all, that David believes in, is in complete control of the future. That's what David believes. That's the same God who smiles down on those who love him. Not the perfect. Notice he doesn't say God smiles on the perfect. He smiles on the righteous. The one who will pursue God's ways out of love for him, even if he doesn't always get it. The righteous isn't the one who's always doing correct. It's the one who's trying to live out God's ways out of a love for God. And those are the ones that God smiles on. Even with all the shit that's happening in life and all the things that might make you anxious, God is smiling on those who are trying, who are loving him and doing their best. This psalm is not chiastic. So the last few ones I was telling you about the chiastic structure, and the thing in the middle is the main point. This one's not that. This one we are to look at as like a strict linear progression in the psalm. So David here, he starts and he's displaying his feelings and he's working through them in song. And that's something we need to do more, right? We need to find songs that relate to us, that we feel. Whether it's Taylor Swift talking about a breakup, whether, it's a nice angry screaming song, or whether sometimes it's a song about love and happiness. We need to find songs that we relate to, that we can express our feelings with, even if we're not songwriters like David. And sometimes our music needs to be relatable, and we don't have to be so damn concerned with good theology in our music. We can just enjoy music. David, which is why I'm not concerned with whether or not David's right about God being the sovereign, knows the future God. This doesn't matter. I can relate to that anxiety. That's what fucking matters. David leads himself to look to God when his anxiety looks to what is around him. So he starts and he's looking around. He's like, I find refuge in the Lord because all the shit's around me. He's starting looking at what's around him. Even though he acknowledges God in the beginning, he's looking at the things that are causing him to be anxious. He doesn't deny his anxiety. At the end, he's like, and now I have no reason to be anxious. He doesn't say, oh, and that anxiety is evil, so God, kill my anxiety and make it better. Nope. He acknowledges it. And he holds on to his anxiety in tension with what he believes about a sovereign God. Anxiety is real. In some cases, right, for anxiety is bad enough, it's actually mentally handy. You can have a handicap of anxiety that's a health issue. You should go get medicine, get it taken care of, see a psychologist. I'm not talking about that kind of anxiety. So, if you need treated, please see a doctor, get treated. That's not what we're talking about. Other cases, there's healthy anxiety. Sometimes it makes complete sense, sometimes it doesn't. We do not need to throw out our emotions or belittle ourselves or others for our anxieties, but rather, we need to focus on who is above and among us. We must believe the God that is in and around us, the God that is up above, who will be with us. He's around us, he's in us, he's above us. That's the same God who's going to be there to give us wisdom, to give us strength, to give us peace, to give us help for all the times we cannot handle our situations alone. Sometimes it feels like a lot of damn situations. He gives us peace that surpasses understanding. He is in us, but even when we doubt that he is in us, he is in those around us. He's in the church, capital C church, the ones that truly follow God. He's in them, and they will come along beside us. He is above, looking over us. He is the most powerful. He is love itself. He is omnipresent. He is immutable, and he is a personable God. As you may have heard on other sermons about God, man, I wish I could describe him to you. He's so great. Look to God. Look to him. Go ahead and fear for your marriage, for your finances. Have anxiety about your country, your children, your friends, all of it. It's okay. Have that fear. Have that anxiety. It is okay. Hold on to it in a healthy way, but also hold in tension the idea that the all-present God loves and sees you where you are, whatever situation you may find yourself. I want you to think of 5 places where you can see God around you right now. For example, could be in your garden, could be in the loving eyes of your spouse. Maybe it's in the smiles of the children next door, or in the kind message that your pastor texted you. And then I want you to take these 5 places and share with a friend. Share with a friend 5 places where you have seen God. Because maybe they're looking for God too. And sharing with them is going to help them find him in more places as well. And maybe they'll share that with someone else. And the church can be the church, right? So we are the church, and we must encourage one another to see God in one another and all around us, among us. If we do this, our anxiety can be manageable. It will persist, but it doesn't have to be as crippling. We will find more love, joy, and peace around us, as we know those are the characteristics of God, who is in all things. Then we'll see less fear, anger, and hate, as we know that those are not of God. If we're looking for God, we won't see those things. Instead, we'll see the characteristics of God, That's what we need to focus on. We don't have to let go of our anxiety or try to get rid of it. We might need to refocus. I don't want you to share this on your public social media accounts if you think it might offend someone. If there's anyone in your feeds who might be upset about all the language or anything like that, just refrain. It does help us if you share. If you think you can do it without offending anybody, then it does help the show a lot with the algorithms and stuff like that. But if there's any chance you might offend somebody, that's not why we do this, so please don't do that. Instead, share it with one friend or family member who might benefit from hearing this, who might take the time to find God in 5 things and share it with someone else, who might be willing to have a conversation with you about what they're anxious about, so that we can have more meaningful conversations about these things and to truly be the church in this time. Guys, let's bring the church back to the common people. Thank you for listening.
This was an Anazao Ministries podcast. If you enjoyed this show and would like to learn more about our network, go to the website in the description below. If you'd like to check out other shows like this, be sure to subscribe to the network.